Well, good morning. If you left church last night and you thought to yourself, boy, I had a hard time following Brother Sam's message, well, so did Brother Sam. So on the way home, even I said, man, what did I say about the millennium? What did I say was amillennialism, post-millennialism, premillennialism? And the bottom line is I boogered it up. And so we're going to take just a minute, and I've got a couple of videos. We're going to use a really fancy new piece of technology to help show exactly what those views are, or close to it, enough to give you a general idea. Short videos. So I hope that it helps, and I hope that it explains these ideas about the millennial reign of Christ. You've got amillennialism, postmillennialism, and premillennialism. There's also a preterist view of the book of Revelation, the idea that all of that is said in Scripture has already happened, already done, over with. We get what we get from now on. Okay, but we don't deal a whole lot with that view. We'll talk about the millennium, and then we'll share with you a little bit about the tribulation to hopefully explain in a more concise and more detailed way, better way anyhow, than I did last night. So hopefully it'll be helpful for you. And let's see what we have here. I'm going to try this again. First, we come in today, and we need to talk about time. All right, you got creation. Creation moves along right up until the greatest event in all history, and that is the coming of Jesus Christ into the world. After the coming of Jesus Christ into the world, you have the church age, and then at some point in the future, there will be the judgment. And that is the span of history. Now, let's talk about the millennium. All right, when we talk about millennialism, we usually speak in three different terms: amillennialism, post-millennialism, premillennialism. Now, amillennial, postmillennial, premillennial, and we're going to begin, first of all, with the amillennial view. All right, amillennial. The idea is there is no millennium, and so you have the church age, which will be at some point ended by the second coming of Christ and the judgment. The second coming of Christ and the judgment concludes the church age, then things progress on from there. However, there is no actual millennium, millennial. Now let's talk about post-millennialism. All right, now post-millennial view is the idea that the millennium effectively at some point began after the coming of Christ. And this is the most positive thinking view, and the idea is that during the age that we're in now, the preaching of the gospel, the working of God's Spirit in the world, that all things will just keep getting better and better and better up until the second coming of Christ and then the judgment. So the idea is that the millennium is now, or at least at some point is soon to be. It does not specify when or even the number of years. So we say 1,000-year reign of Christ. They do not take that literally. And so that is the idea of the post-millennial view, that the judgment of Christ, the second coming of Christ, will occur after the millennium. But that is the post-millennium view. And then the pre-millennial view. All right, now the pre-millennial view is the idea that we are living now in the church age. Christ died, was buried, rose again. The church was instituted, and at some point the church will be complete. Whenever that occurs, we don't know when, but God the Father does. When that is finished, the idea is that then the tribulation, the great tribulation, will begin. That's a 7-year period. After the tribulation begins, the second coming of Christ will occur. At the end of the Great Tribulation, the second coming of Christ occurs, and then the millennial reign of Christ, literally, physically on earth, begins and will last for 1,000 years. And after that time, then you have the Great Judgment. And so that's the idea of pre-millennialism. All right, so that gives us a little bit of a better descriptor about the millennial views
regarding the book of Revelation. But let's look now, and more specifically within premillennial ideas, you have the question about, well, when, if the second coming occurs, if the rapture occurs separately at the same time as, or maybe somewhere in between. And so hopefully this will help shed some light on that for us.
Okay, so now we're going to talk for just a moment about the tribulation. And this is a little more specific because all of these views fall within the pre-millennial understanding that we are living in a time before the literal millennial reign of Christ on the earth, and that millennial reign will occur after the second coming of Christ and after what we know as the Great Tribulation. When you talk about post, mid, or pre-tribulation, what we're talking about is the rapture generally. And so the idea is that if you are post-tribulation, that the rapture of Christ, the coming of Christ and the rapture of Christ occur simultaneously, and that occurs at the end of the Great Tribulation. That's why they call it post-tribulation. So the second coming and the rapture would occur at the same time, right before the millennial reign of Christ. So that is post-tribulation. When we talk about mid-tribulation, we're talking about the Antichrist's revelation and the rapture of the church. And those who fall into this idea of mid-tribulation think that the rapture of Christ, of the church, the taking away of the church, will occur just before or right after, but at the same time, effectively, as the revelation of the Antichrist, when he stands and declares that all people should worship him, just before the second half of the Great Tribulation, and then the second coming, then the millennium, and then judgment thereafter. So that gives you the idea of mid-tribulation. And then you have the pre-tribulation. Now, pre-tribulation, what the idea is here is that the Great Tribulation, the day of Jacob's trouble, the day of the wrath of the Lamb, will not come about until Christ's church is completed. When the church is completed, then the rapture of the church occurs. Then the Great Tribulation begins. All 7 years occur. At the end of those 7 years, the second coming of Christ, then the millennial reign, and then the judgment. So the rapture occurs prior to, or before the tribulation.
All right, I hope that gives you a better grasp. Of course, I'm not sure that I have the best grasp myself on all these things. Obviously, I fall into the camp. I'm pre-millennial. I'm pre-tribulation. That's my disposition, not dispensation, but my disposition. And typically when you look at these different views, those who fall towards the amillennial view of Revelation tend to take more of Scripture allegorically than they do. I'm not going to say literally, because not all Scripture is meant to be interpreted literally. God uses figures, He uses similes, He uses all sorts of figures of speech. But the debate is between allegorical interpretation and serious interpretation. And when you move toward the premillennial side of things, you tend to take more of Scripture seriously, and interpret it thus that, and certainly Christ took Scripture seriously. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So everything is important, is why I tend to fall into that premillennial, pre-tribulation camp. But wherever you fall on the spectrum, hopefully that gives you a better idea of some of the interpretations, some of the ideas about it. This is not the most important thing. The most important thing is understanding who Christ is, that He came, that He died, that He rose again, and that He is coming back. But again, what do you do with all the statements about the when and where and how and what all is going to be happening? It is intriguing. You don't need to get caught up in it to the point that you fail to live today and worship today as we ought to worship and as we ought to live with Christ. And so anyway, I hope that helps. Hope that explains some things a little bit more effectively and efficiently than I did last night. And if you have questions, feel free to ask in turn, and we'll talk to you. See you soon.